Hey everyone, Nick from Accounting Add-ons here. In this video, I'll show you how to configure incremental refresh to use with Power BI. Now it's worth mentioning that incremental refresh only works on Power BI on the cloud, but has to be configured via Power BI on the desktop. Now let's get into it. So I'm in Power BI on the desktop, and what I'll do is I'll go get data from OData feed. Now I'll jump quickly to OdataLink and get the URL I need. Copy that and paste that in. Now for the purpose of this exercise, we're using Xero demo data, but this works just as well in MYOB as well. So I'll scroll down and choose Invoices Expanded, and I'll click Transform. Now what I'll need to do first is set up two parameters, and they have to be given a very specific name of RangeStart and RangeEnd. Otherwise, Power BI won't detect that incremental refresh is enabled. So I'll go Manage Parameters, and I'll create two new parameters. The first one will be RangeStart, and I'll make it a date time. I'll set the value to the 1st of January 2022. And the next parameter will be RangeEnd. And I'll also make it a date time, and I'll also set it to the 31st of January 2022. Now it's important when you choose the type that you choose date time, because incremental refresh only gets detected if the parameters are called RangeStart and RangeEnd and are of the date time data type. It doesn't work with date, and it doesn't work with date time zone, which when we set up our formula, we'll actually have to put a very specific structure around our criteria. It's also important to stress that it is case sensitive. So you need to use RangeStart with a capital R and a capital S, and RangeEnd with a capital R and capital E. Once I've done that, I can click OK, and I've got my parameters set up. So now that we've defined the parameters, it's time to apply them. What we'll do first, however, is we'll add a filter to filter the data by date, and we'll hard code the filter we want to use. Now when setting up incremental refresh, it's important to use the correct field. In this example of invoices, we want to use the date column, but we wouldn't want to use the updated date UTC. Using the updated date UTC runs the risk of having problems to do with partitions, which I will touch base a bit later in the video. So we'll scroll back and return to our date column. So we'll go to the date column and drop it down and choose date time zone filters and choose between. We'll type in a date of 1st of January 22 to 31st of March 22 and click OK. And that'll add the filter to filter our data. Now it's important that the filter is actually early in the steps. You can see here it's the 3rd step down the list, and that ensures that the filters will actually be folded into the Power Query that will be actually sent to OdataLink. If you do it too late in the process, you run the risk of not having that filter passed into OdataLink. Next, we'll edit the formula. So we'll highlight our first hard-coded date time zone, and we'll replace it with date.time add zone, passing in the range start, 0 to specify GMT 0. And we'll do the same thing for the end date. We'll replace it with date.time add zone, range end, 0. And if we click out, it's already filtered the data. Now if we go to our parameters, we can change it to the 1st of January 22 to the 31st of March 22. And if we click back onto our invoice expanded, you can actually see it's filtered the data. Now the reason we're converting our date time to a date time zone is because the date column's actually a date time zone, which you can tell because it's got the +00, which is the time zone, displayed within the column. Now if that wasn't the case, and the date was just a traditional date or a traditional date time field, we wouldn't have to worry about adding the time zone or converting to a date time zone. We could use the range start and the range end directly within the formula. Now because our field is a date time zone, we need to do this extra step. Now the reason we use the datetime.addZone function and pass in 0 as the time zone is to force the time zone in, and that ensures that the time zone will be set to GMT regardless of how the server is configured. If we used any other function, we do run the risk of adding the time zone of the server into the date time, and that could actually change how the data is downloaded. So now that we've added our filter, we're ready to configure the incremental refresh. The final step is actually done through Power BI and not Power Query. So we'll click Close and Apply and return to Power BI. On the right hand side against our endpoint, we'll right click and choose Incremental Refresh. Now if it's set up correctly, we'll have the option to turn it on and off. But if you've made any mistake with the names of the actual parameters or the data type, this option will not be available. The main thing to turn it on is to select the table you want to set it up for, click on the incremental refresh to enable it, enter how many days or years you want to retain the data for, so I'll choose, let's say, 2 years, and enter how many days to refresh. So I could say refresh the data if it's 7 days old. Now the combination of these two options will determine how far back the first query, once we upload it to Power BI on the cloud, how long it'll take. The more years we download or the more months we download, the longer it'll take to do the initial load. But after that, every single refresh will use these settings. So it'll refresh the data for the last 7 days in our example. Power BI allows you to choose the increment, whether you choose days, months, quarters, or years. And what you choose here will make it work slightly differently. If I choose 2 years, it'll actually send 2 calls, 1 for each year. And it'll actually partition the data year by year. Now that's different than if I say 24 months, where it would send 24 calls, 1 for each month, and would partition the data 1 month at a time. So it's important to choose the right increment for what you're trying to achieve, knowing that the unit that you choose, whether it's years, days, months, or quarters, has an impact on how many calls have to be taken place and how the data will essentially expire. Now it's also important when entering the incremental portion of the incremental refresh that you choose settings that will allow you to download updates. At the moment it's set to 7 days, which will give me a window of 7 days for it to download updates. But after that 7 days, those invoices won't get resynchronized and consequently the edits won't appear in the data set. Now if that's not suitable, you may want to choose wider settings, as in 30 days or 2 or 3 months, just to make sure the updates get re-downloaded. You also have an option to only refresh complete days and not partial days. Once you've turned on all these options, you can click Apply. Once it's all configured, we're ready to publish. So we'll go File, Publish, Publish to Power BI. We'll choose my workspace and click Select, and I'll just wait for it to publish. Once it's published, I can go to Power BI on the cloud and hit refresh. If I expand my workspace, I'll see my data set. Now because I've just published it recently, I'll click on the ... button and go Settings. I'll set up the credentials for access to the OData feed. I'll just click Sign In. Now to test that it's all working, I'll click on the ... and choose Refresh Now. And I'll wait for the actual data set to be refreshed. If I go to the OData feeds page in OdataLink and click on the Logs button, I'll be able to actually see all the calls that took place. And you can see here each individual day being queried. And if I scroll down, at some point you'll find the actual log of each individual year being queried. And you can see it here where it queried 1 financial year at a time for 2020, 2021, and here is where it started 2022. And that confirms that incremental refresh is all up and running. Now that brings us to the end of the video showing you how to configure incremental refresh with Power BI. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.